Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hamish Chalmers. I'm co-director of the Oxford Education Deanery, which is in part of the Department of Education at the University of Oxford with a mission to empower educational practitioners and policy professionals worldwide to understand, use and co-produce high-quality research evidence in education. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to the webinar today, Teaching the Environment in Religion, Philosophy and Ethics. Delighted that we've got joining us today Dr. Thomas Sinclair, Dr. Nigel Fancourt, Kate Christopher, Rebecca Osler, and Matt Pritchard. And the entire shebang will be chaired and guided through by Megan Murray-Pepper, who is a member of the Oxford Education Deanery's sustainability team. So welcome to them, and thanks very much for coming together for this, what I'm sure is going to be an energizing and productive discussion around a very important issue. Just before I hand over to Megan, I want to encourage you to sign up to the Deanery's mailing list. We have lots of different events and activities, such as online webinars and in-person events, as well as short plain language summaries of the research that's conducted in the department, a podcast series about our research, and resources that can be used in the classroom or to inform policy and practice decisions in education. At the end of the session, you'll see some information for giving feedback on today's webinar, and also some links to the department website and the Deanery website specifically, so that you can stay in touch with us and we can stay in touch with you. Again, just before I hand over, I want to remind everybody that today's webinar is being recorded. If you would rather not appear on screen, then please feel free to keep your video turned off. But by the same token, if you'd like to be on screen, then you're very welcome to turn it on. So without further ado, I shall pass over to Megan Murray-Pepper, who will begin today's proceedings.
Thank you, Hamish. And hi, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here with us for the webinar this evening. As Hamish said, I'm a member of the sustainability team, working with the Deanery to produce a series of events. And this webinar is part of a series we're doing, which is all about how different school disciplines can all have a kind of distinct role to play in integrating sort of environmental awareness and knowledge within the curriculum. So we started last year with an English webinar and a history webinar, and this is the first of our sort of subject-specific ones this year. So I won't talk too much at all, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the format this evening. We're going to hear from all of our speakers. So we're going to hear from a range of researchers, practitioners about what's going on in RE and philosophy at every level, really, of education. So we're going to hear a little bit about primary, secondary, and indeed sort of tertiary questions in RE and philosophy. And each of the speakers is going to talk for a short while about their particular area. And then at the end of the presentations, we're going to invite you all to go into breakout rooms, because there's quite a few of us here today, and have a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes, just to chat and respond to what you've heard, and to think about how the opportunities in RE and philosophy might apply in your own context. And then we'll all come back together at the end, and that will be the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers and have a bit more of a conversation together about the themes that have arisen in those presentations. So I'm going to hand over now to the first one of our speakers, and that is Dr. Tom Sinclair. Tom is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford and a Fellow at Wadham College. And he's going to talk just a little bit about the questions that philosophers are now asking about the environment. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks for inviting me to come to this. It's really exciting to be here, sharing the exciting philosophical dimensions of environment and climate. So what I've tried to do, I'm going to take about 5 minutes just to survey from a very, very distant bird's eye view, kind of eagle's eye view, some of the currents in philosophy that are responding to issues relating to the environment. So I've distinguished 9, which are on this slide in front of you, and I will just do a kind of whistle-stop tour of them. As with just about any subject you care to mention, there are uncountable philosophical dimensions that are exciting and worth exploring. But these ones are sites of active debate, and so if you're interested in pursuing any of them in your own teaching, in your own thinking, there are resources that we can point you to. So they're relatively tractable in that sense. So the first dimension is what I've called the value of nature. And this is, there are philosophically interesting questions about how to conceptualize the value of nature, how to think about it. You might think that very commonly people think about it in terms of instrumental value, the value it has for us, for other things. So the use value it has. But of course, there are other ways to think about the value, most obviously in terms of intrinsic value. So we might think that nature or aspects of nature or parts of nature have intrinsic value. And philosophers have devoted some attention to trying to figure out how best to think of that intrinsic value. It's not enough just to say it has intrinsic value, because all sorts of things have intrinsic value. And the kind of intrinsic value it has is distinct from others. So people have pointed to the fact that there is life, but of course that doesn't take into account of some aspects of nature. There's selfhood, we might think there's sentience, there's desires, there's purposes, there's order, there's complexity, there's creativity, there's diversity, there's uniqueness, there's an evolutionary genealogy. There's the fact that nature is in some sense independent of us, although that might be disputed as well. There is, of course, beauty. There's richness. There's interconnectedness. There's variety. And so all of these things might be thought to feed into a conception of the intrinsic value of nature. And of course, there are, as always in philosophy, there are disputes between proponents of different conceptions of the intrinsic value of nature, which are interesting and worth exploring. So there's a very rich debate about the value of nature, just straight up. But then there's a further debate, a second debate about the morality relating to these things, and that's most familiar, I think, to many people in the field of animal rights specifically. And in fact, it's quite difficult to explain what the grounds of any rights that animals or any other part of nature might have. Rights are typically, the philosophy of rights typically grounds rights in features of the right holder, which are, surprise, surprise, human specific, or at least human specific and human adjacent. So things like rationality, and the ability to find meaning or something like that, the ability to have a point to one's life. But of course, if you ground rights that way, you're going to have trouble extending rights to much of the natural world. So there's a rich debate between kind of anthropocentric conceptions of rights and non-anthropocentric conceptions of rights. And then there's a further set of debates between individualists who seek the ground of the rights of a being in the nature of that being, and what you might think of as ecocentricists who think of the grounds of rights as having something to do with the place that the right holder has in a wider web. So there's lots of debates about the grounds of rights and the way in which rights might be extended or not to parts of the natural world other than humans. And then, of course, on top of that, there are just standard philosophical theories of morality and questions about their capacity to give a plausible story of the morality of our relations with nature. So just as an example, Kantian conceptions of morality found it on rationality and rationality and freedom, the freedom of rational beings. And there's just this notorious problem that they have accounting for the thought that any other being, any non-rational being, could be the source of constraints on us at all, moral constraints on us at all. Other views may do better. So there's an interesting set of questions about how these kind of standard template theories, consequentialism, Kantian views, and so on, feed into these questions about nature specifically in the environment. So my third topic is about future generations and the non-identity problem. The non-identity problem is this really fun problem, which basically stems from the fact that whether you exist or not depends on a whole bunch of circumstances, which are very particular and might easily not have happened. So of course, for you to exist, a specific sperm had to meet a specific egg and might easily not have done so had the circumstances been ever so slightly different. And it just turns out that because this is true, it looks very likely that if we act, however terribly we act in respect of nature, the people who exist as a result will be radically different from the people, not just different in character, but actually numerically different people from the people who exist if we act as we think well. And that makes it hard to explain why the people who exist in a future which is environmentally despoiled could have any particular reason to object to our doing that, our bringing about that environment, because they wouldn't have existed otherwise. So questions about how to make sense of duties to future generations, to future people, to future beings more generally are philosophically live and exciting. The fourth topic relates quite closely to the value of nature topic, I suppose, but it's very specific. It's specifically about the beauty of nature and making sense of that and making sense of the appreciation of nature. So nature and the appreciation of nature are a challenge to various theories of beauty. So, for example, theories that say the beauty lies in sort of the harmonious arrangement of parts or something like that. So formalist theories like that, which are basically well suited to art maybe, but not so well to natural beauty. Nature's a kind of challenge to those, and also to theories of aesthetic appreciation, which focus on a kind of contemplative attitude, again, which might seem appropriate for art, but doesn't seem so well suited to going for walks in nature or the kind of engaged aesthetic appreciation of nature that seems very familiar. So there's a set of philosophical problems that relate to that. A second value-focused question is about the value of species or ecologies or of biodiversity, trying to make sense of the value of those things as contrasted with the values of the individuals. So, for example, sometimes we think that it's appropriate to do something to an individual member of a species for the protection of the species more generally, something harmful for the protection of the species more generally or for the population more generally. And there are real complicated questions about what the status of a species is, what the value of a species is if it's not instrumental. So while it's not that hard to explain what the value of an where the intrinsic value lies in the case of an individual member of a species, an individual bird, say, it's a bit harder to say what the value is, where the value lies in a species, in the ongoing existence of a species, especially given that evolution means that species are coming into existence and going out of existence all the time. A more familiar philosophical set of questions lies in the area of climate justice. So there are lots of quite well worked out theories of climate justice, in particular having to do with who should bear the burdens, such burdens as there are, of a transition to securing a sustainable, livable world for everyone. There are these principles, these well-known principles, polluter pays type principles that pay attention to historical emissions, for example, but other principles such as distribution by ability to pay is also a kind of leading contender, and then there are various others. And there are also questions about the relation of climate justice to other aspects of justice, such as human rights, questions of colonialism and historical injustice. So that's a very live set of questions as well. Finally, the final three, there are some interesting questions about individual responsibility and collective impact. So it's a live debate in philosophy here, how I should think about my responsibilities, given that what I do makes no or a negligible difference to some collective action problem. So there are these really interesting discussions about whether, for example, in the case of climate change, my individual emissions, if they make no difference in the aggregate or make only a marginal negligible difference in the aggregate, how can it be argued that those emissions, I have a responsibility to reduce my emissions, for example? So there are really interesting questions there. And relatedly, there are questions about the ethics of risk. So on a global level, the things like geoengineering represent a bunch of risks, and climate change itself represents a bunch of risks rather than a bunch of certainties. And there are questions, difficult questions about the ethics and how we're supposed to think about the morality associated with taking risks, especially when the payoffs and the downsides stretch over an indefinitely long time. And the final one I wanted to mention was there's a bunch of questions in political philosophy about the politics of environmentalism. So there are just sort of standard questions about political legitimacy, that are super interesting about whether we have obligations to obey the law, and whether civil disobedience can be justified and how it's justified, and under what conditions a government or a state or a political authority becomes illegitimate, such that fighting it is not wrong or is not in some sense not justified, and in what sense environmental concerns can justify the conclusion that a government is illegitimate or a state or a political system is illegitimate, and what the thresholds are for civil disobedience, even in cases where they're legitimate. So as you see, as this very, very short summary, and I'm sorry that it was so quick, shows you, there's just this enormous variety of interesting philosophical questions. I hope you find them as exciting as I do, even given only that brief summary. I'm happy to say much more about any of them should anybody have any questions, but for now I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. Wow, that is a vast range of yeah, like knotty, teasing, interesting questions to get your teeth into. And it'll be fascinating to see where some of those same issues perhaps arise in you know, the curriculum at other stages and where they come up for discussion. So we're going to move on now to some secondary and primary teachers talking about particularly religion, ecology and education, as you can see. And this is teachers working on a scheme called the RE Connect project, which is a fellowship scheme which supports teachers to develop innovative curriculum projects exploring the environment within religious education. And I'm sure Kate will say more about that. So I'll just briefly introduce our three speakers, our three teachers. Dr. Kate Christopher is a senior lecturer and an RE teacher, senior lecturer in education at Anglia Ruskin University, and she's a national RE advisor. Rebecca Ostler is an author and an RE teacher at Barnabas Oley Primary School, C of E Primary School in Cambridgeshire. And Matt Pitcher is the head of RE at Upper Shirley High School in Southampton and also a national RE advisor. And each of them is going to talk a bit about the project that they've worked on and the kind of resources and curriculum input that they've come up with. So over to you, Kate.
Lovely, thanks so much, Megan, and thank you, Tom. I wonder if we could have a sort of bingo game with all the philosophical and ethical ideas Tom's given us. I know for a fact that the politics of environmentalism would be a tick in the box when you listen to Matt's account. So Matt, Rebecca and I worked on a project called RE Connect. Matt and Rebecca are school teachers and they were fellows on the project and I was their mentor. And the aim of the project is to bring teachers, RE teachers, primary and secondary, into contact with up-to-date scholarship around, firstly, climate, environment, activism, that sort of thinking, and also religion, philosophy, ethics, that sort of thinking. So it was the perfect combination for us. So I'm just going to share a few ideas. I'm not going to take very much time. Just some ideas I took from the project that I think we as teachers could certainly teach. And then I'm going to hand over to Rebecca and Matt. And as fellows, they actually created some curriculum materials. We are going to be having this all hosted on a website quite soon. I know there's a way that you can give your details if you want to through the poll at the end of the session. If you want to pass on your email addresses, I can get them, I think, and let you know when the website goes live. And also, before I get started, there will be a second, well, actually, this is the second year. There will be a third year of the RE Connect project, and I hope a fourth and a fifth year. And we are deliberately trying to build a network of teachers across the country who are interested in this field and want to bring it to our classrooms. So again, please share your details if you'd like to, and we'll be in touch with you. We'll call you. Okay, so just a few ideas from the project that I think we could actually teach, really up-to-date thinking. So we enjoyed a talk by the geographer, Professor of Geography, Mike Hume, and he's actually at Cambridge, and here's a link to his website if you wanted to check him out. Now, he's written about climate change for years, many years, from a sort of natural sciences perspective, but he noted in a talk to us as RE practitioners that in his view, climate science can be totally blind to the role religion plays in human lives. For example, he cited one of the IPCC reports, which has 1.5 million words and only mentions religion 13 times. He also cited Naomi Klein's book on climate and capitalism as an example of a sort of partly theoretical, partly journalistic, partly polemical book that has quite broad appeal, and that makes no mention of religion at all. And so Mike Hume was arguing to us, and we all agreed with him, that this is an omission. This is something that should not be overlooked. We in the secular West might be used to a less religious society, but actually in the world out there, religion is by far the norm. Religion and religious people are the majority. And so Mike Hume argues that it is an omission to leave out the religious dimension in people's lives when we think about dealing with climate change, climate collapse. He talked about the more than science approaches that will be needed as humanity makes sense of whatever is around the corner. So Mike Hume talked about these two words that are familiar to lots of us within religious studies and also sociology of religion, and for that matter, philosophy, mythos and logos. And I'm giving you these ideas because I think these are certainly things we could teach to our students in school, our RE students. So I actually first encountered the idea of mythos and logos myself in a book by Karen Armstrong, a 2000 book called The Battle for God, which is about fundamentalism. This is quite a widely used set of terms within religious studies or sociology of religion. So why would we be teaching these? How can these ideas help us to address this field in the classroom? Well, I'm going to use Karen Armstrong's definition because it's just one I'm familiar with. So mythos and logos are like two different but both essential forms of thinking, two different but essential modes of thinking that humans engage in. And the main point here is that we need both of them. And I definitely think this is something that we could teach, and I think you can already think of examples you could share with your pupils and then have them sort of unpack what mythos and logos thinking is. So mythos thinking is, I'm going to start with logos. Logos thinking is about measurements, it's about precision, it's about accuracy, it's about logic. Logos thinking is about how to build a house that won't fall down, or make a boat that won't float, or what berries you shouldn't eat. And that's obviously essential for our survival. But mythos thinking is also essential for our survival. And Karen Armstrong even describes it as early psychology or early therapy. Mythos is stories, poetry, myth, of course, song. Mythos gives us meaning and hope. Mythos is expressed through metaphor and narrative, all the sorts of things we deal with in RE all the time. And mythos is essential to our survival because it helps us to cope with the appalling capriciousness, really, of existence. And so Mike Hume's argument is that we need to engage the religious, the mythic, the metaphorical as a human species and within our own communities, our languages and our cultures to make sense of how we address this next stage in our struggle for survival. So that's the first idea I took from the talks we encountered that I thought I could certainly teach. And thinking about mythos and logos reminded me of a book I'd read quite recently by a sociologist of religion called Robert Bellah, who talks about the role of mythos and logos in the axial civilizations. And again, this is something we can definitely teach. So if you haven't heard the term, the axial age is a period of time between 800 BCE to 300 BCE. Oh, sorry, there's a typo there, 800 BCE to 300 BCE. And 5 civilizations back in the day went through this axial transformation, and I've noted them there on the slide if you're not familiar with this thinking. And Robert Bellah, this whole book is about how religion sort of, accelerated human evolution, accelerated and allowed us to move into this axial transformation era, which we are still in. The point of this book is that we are still in it. It has been 2,500 years, but we still live within these axial age modes of thinking. What defines the axial age civilizations? Well, Bellah argues that in this time, birthed often through struggle, through conflict, a new universalist, a new communal spiritual era came to be, in which all people, whoever they are, can access, let's call it the ultimate truth, the ultimate meaning or reality. So maybe through holy books or through hearing the prophets, or through meditation or contemplation, or through ritual and practice. This is the axial kind of transformation. And this is the world we still live in today. And we may be so used to this mode of thinking, we don't even realize that it in itself has a history. Now, I'm going to Robert Bellah because he raises a really interesting point at the end of this book. He asks, maybe, are we standing on the brink of a new axial age? We have new struggles, we have new challenges, to put it mildly, facing us in the next few hundred years, if we can survive for that long. We need new myths, maybe. We need new modes of thinking about survival. And so again, this is a set of questions you could bring to your class. I don't know what the answer is. We probably won't be alive long enough to see it, but they will be. So we could teach a little bit about the axial civilizations, show that these in themselves were victories of ethics of a new era, and ask, do we think we're standing at the brink of a new axial era? So these were two ideas I took from the sessions that we encountered. And one last point to make before I hand over to Rebecca and Matt is that Robert Bellah notes in his book that in the axial eras, as they were coming to be, religious criticism was combined with social criticism. So the social criticism was essentially the struggle against injustice, the struggle against like crushing injustice and inequality. But it was religious criticism in its various forms, to use the term quite broadly, that allowed these civilizations to kind of come into being. So again, that's another strand there. You could ask your students, are we going to need a new set of myths, almost a new way of imagining ourselves as humans, a new cosmology, in order to meet the challenges of the next few hundred years? Okay, that's some input from me. I'm going to hand over now first to Rebecca, and she'll tell you a little bit about herself, and she's going to share with you the curriculum materials that she's designed as part of this project. So right straight to Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. I teach in a very small primary school, and I applied for the fellowship because I was thinking, not sure how much I'm seeing across the school that's dealing with the environmental crisis. And I wasn't really sure what I was doing as the RE lead, or what I should be doing as the RE lead. Our subject is now called Religion and Worldviews, and hadn't really unpicked that yet with my children. And I was thinking, well, what is a worldview? So it's a person's way of perceiving and experiencing and responding to the world. But actually, is that just restricted to human beings, or should we widen that to other species, or maybe things like rivers? So I was really interested in certain cases where people were campaigning to give rights to rivers in an attempt to protect them from pollution, things like that. Yeah, so how far the idea of personhood could be expanded was one thing. And I was also thinking, I used to be a secondary school teacher, and I absolutely loved teaching environmental ethics at A-level. And I was wondering whether I could drop some of the thinking from people like Peter Singer or James Lovelock. Could they drop into primary school, and what would my children make of them? Because I have learned in the last 9 years or so not to underestimate the amazing things that primary children can come up with. When I was a secondary school teacher, I don't think I had much of a clue what year sevens might be bringing me. So I developed a scheme of work, and the key question was, what can we learn by listening to other species? And it was designed for upper Key Stage 2, so that's really 10 and 11-year-olds. But Key Stage 1, the teachers there adapted it for their classes. And I also think it could contain quite a lot of challenge for Key Stage 3. So in terms of the children's reactions to this scheme of work, it was really, really encouraging. So they engaged in some really deep thinking, and it also had quite a noticeable emotional impact. So for example, at the beginning of the scheme of work, there was just absolute silence when we were watching a little bit of video on how elephants in an area of Chad were working as gardeners to rebuild and restore their ecosystem. And they were working very much alongside some really brave rangers to combat poaching, and that was the rangers, and bring the space back to life in terms of forging ways through the undergrowth with their movement, pulling things off trees to allow some more light to come through. The children were absolutely silent, just taking that on board, how elephants and human beings could work together. We had a look at the work of Dr. Jane Goodall, and again, the children were absolutely fascinated by beginning to see the similarities between chimpanzees and human beings. There was one bit where a chimpanzee was using a tool. So it broke off a stem and it was putting it in an anthill, waiting for the ants to climb up and then eating them. That just made the children gasp. And they began to make links with other topics they were doing. So for example, in DT, we're trying to think of inventions that might meet some of the UN's sustainability goals. And one child said, maybe we should be listening more and looking more to creatures like chimpanzees, who seem to be coming up with simple ways of solving problems rather than really overcomplicated ideas. We moved on to a really in-depth look at what the Bible might have to contribute. And the children were really determined. So what we did was, I think, quite challenging. They had a card sort. They had some key biblical quotes. So lots of really interesting teachings that we explored as part of our fellowship. And then they had to match them with meanings, which is fairly standard. Only as they got on with the task did they realize that there were a lot more meanings cards than there were biblical teachings. So then they had to try and work out which meanings might attach to which teaching and which were more clear matches. So that raised some really interesting questions. So for example, looking at things like love your neighbor as yourself, which is something that my children could probably churn out, they started thinking, well, could that extend to animals? Might they be your neighbors in some sense? We also started thinking about whether our neighbors might stretch around the world. So how would, what kind of consideration should we give to people who are already really suffering the effects of climate change? So it really deepened our thinking. Generally, they were just really, really curious about the issues raised. And there were just fantastic questions like, why do human beings think we can sort it out if we cause the mess? And another brilliant one, are religious people less likely to take action as they think that God will just sort it out? Which I think are amazing questions from 10-year-olds. So you probably think at the end of my teaching, I would have been absolutely amazed and really, really happy. But it ended, that bit ended in real disappointment. Our final piece was a creative piece, and we were looking at the idea of an ecological Shabbat. So the idea in the Bible that the rest of Shabbat should extend to somebody's animals. How can we maybe broaden that out? And the children could just reel off loads of ways to look after the environment. So recycling, litter picking, etc., etc. But they didn't, it sounds harsh, but they didn't really seem to care. The emotion wasn't there at all. So I'd had grand plans about taking it to the head teacher, but it was just an academic exercise, I think, to most of the children. And that really made me think. I began to wonder exactly how connected to the natural world my children were. And I did some little wildlife quizzes at the beginning of some of the days. And it really revealed that they don't know that much about our native wildlife. So we did some ID quizzes, and the most common 12 most common British birds, I think most of them could maybe identify 3. So there was a lack of knowledge there. I was kind of wondering about why. So maybe less time spent outside, maybe their parents' knowledge isn't great, maybe down to things like COVID, being inside a lot more. I asked them maybe to do I set up optional homework to interview an older member of their family or an older friend of the family about their recollections of spending time in the natural world. And that did open up quite a lot of discussion. And yeah, since doing further reading, I've learned really that this has a name. So shifting baseline syndrome is this idea that, so my parents' generation can really feel some losses that I can't. So the ability to go and pick cornflowers in a field, That's something my mum misses. I mourn bullfinches that used to be in my village. So I don't miss the cornflowers because I didn't know they were there, but I miss the bullfinches. And the children I teach have no idea, because they're so young, they have no idea of what they're missing. So I think one of the things I would like to do is connect them more to their local natural environment, the beauty of it and what they are missing and what future generations might be missing, to connect them a little bit more. It's really clear that RE can't contain all of this, that in order to have an impact, we need to extend it across the curriculum and across the school. So we've tried things, yeah, like meat-free Mondays. We have tried to drop useful things into lots of different trips. So in primary school, you might go out for a whole day trip somewhere, say to look at, to learn about dinosaurs at a dinosaur kind of amusement park or education park. But there's no reason at lunchtime that you couldn't do a quick wildlife scavenger hunt, for example. We had an RE trip where we were going to visit a local church, and it was absolutely chucking it down with rain in May. We had obviously not planned for that. This is the picture. And as we went in, I was just thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have to spend so long inside this church. What are we going to do? So kind of ad-libbing, we asked all the children to lay down in the nave and look up at the roof and to think about what it reminded them of. So they talked about things like maybe the ribs of a whale. We talked about ribs protecting us. They talked quite quickly about it looking like an upturned boat, which led us to thinking about us maybe all being in the same boat, particularly while we're hearing the rain coming down. We discussed a bit more about having to steer together and how being in the same boat might help us tackle climate change. And the vicar then told us a link between the word nave and navel, which again was fascinating and just came out of a bit of quick thinking on a really difficult trip, or what could have been a difficult trip. I've linked to news stories, like for example, could a river be a person? Could an ape be a person? That was linked to a bit of news. Some of Banks's artwork. We entered the National Spirited Arts competition and picked some of the green themes. And I'm going to try some eco poetry with them, particularly linking to our rivers and oceans topic. So thinking about, again, about what is a river, could it be seen as a person, and linking it to what we're doing in art, where we're looking at portraits and magical realism. So it's just a case of, I think, of keeping thinking about it and expanding out through the RE topics, but also through the wider curriculum. And at some point this term, my write-up's going to be in RE Today. So if people wanted to read about it in a bit calmer, slower manner, that's where it will be. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That's so fantastic and so stimulating. I'm handing over to you, Matt. And Matt, will you introduce yourself, please? Thanks so much.
Yeah. Hi there, everyone. My name is Matt Pitcher. I'm head of religious studies at Upper Shirley High in Southampton. Whilst I was on this fellowship, I was teaching in the New Forest. So I've moved from a rural area to an urban area, and I can definitely tell the difference in terms of the environment around me. But I've always had an interest in teaching about the environment and climate change. I'm of the generation where we sat in assemblies learning about the hole in the ozone layer, CFCs, hunting of whales, the Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace. If you sat in cold school halls in the 80s and the early 90s, that's what you got during your assembly time. And I've taught GCSE religious studies for about 25 years. And we've often get the principles about stewardship, caring for the planet, God's creation, and that's neatly packaged within those exam criteria and the specifications. But sometimes I feel that they're a little bit lacking, and our pupils don't actually understand these in like real world issues. So for my sins, I'm a keen runner, and I'm also a member of the Green Runners, which is a an environmental group within running, which looks at how our impact on the planet from our kit, from our trainers, the food that we eat, our outlook. And we all make 4 pledges when we join about what we're going to do to improve our personal environment and the environment around us. And I tried to get the pupils at the beginning to think about 4 pledges that they could have by the end of the unit that we were going to study. And I think within RE, we've got a unique opportunity almost to highlight the issues around climate and climate change and how religion has an impact on this. We often talk about RE talking about the human condition and how we see ourselves in the world and the universe. And that much of religious belief is about where do we fit into the world. And this religions and worldviews approach we teach in the classroom needs to have a connection with the world around us, and about the magnificence of nature and the awe and wonder, the numinous, the feeling that when we look at a beautiful sunrise or we look over a calm ocean, we have that kind of emotional connect. And that what we often see on our TV screens, on social media and across the web is the destruction of the natural world. And there is a real big issue at the moment in LA with those wildfires and how climate change has kind of affected the communities around Los Angeles. That's being played out before our eyes. And it's asking our pupils to think about these kind of issues. So as part of the fellowship, we had online community where we listened and talked to relevant specialists in their area. And I was really infused by looking at scriptural reasoning and taking a piece of biblical text and breaking it down and seeing what it meant to us. And I thought, how can I include that into my teaching? So we started looking at the creation stories within Judaism and Christianity. And I designed a short scheme to look at the idea. And the working title was Whose World Is It and Who Cares? Because I think it's got different meanings for different people, this title. And we looked at the issues facing the environment today coming from that creation story. Why are things happening in our world? And then I wanted to look at our local aspect. So by teaching in the New Forest, I was living and working and driving through every day an area of outstanding natural beauty, a national park, so much money invested in it, people living off the land. And I linked to a couple of the eco churches around the school and the community that the pupils had lived in. And we looked at how do eco churches work within the local community, what kind of projects they do, why do they do that, and linking again back to the creation story, the idea of stewardship, the idea of loving our neighbor, as Rebecca was talking about, in terms of our Christian ethos that runs within a lot of our pupils. And we're really lucky that actually I didn't know this until I started to teach about it, that a lot of those eco church projects revolve around the school. So they revolve around what we're doing in our school garden, our eco greenhouses made out of plastic bottles, all of those kind of things were starting to fit in, and the pupils could put those bits together. I then wanted to have a look at the national aspect and looking at what is going on nationally. And so I looked at religious groups within Extinction Rebellion, which might cause a little bit of consternation amongst some people, but I thought it was a really gritty introduction to ethical questions. Is it right to break the law to protect our planet? Is it right that people are sentenced because they are demonstrating what's happened to the planet? In terms of certainly the sanctions that they face, but the oracy that has come from this has been magnificent. Pupils being able to fiercely discuss and debate and break apart people's arguments and looking at the equality and the fairness within that. And then my final part was to look at the global ideas around this, and looking at Christian aid and climate justice, which is a huge driver of Christian aid's focus now around the world, and the projects looking at making it equal for all people to have access to clean water, but how is the climate affecting that area? But that links also again with racial justice, and then looking at Buddhism and the global environment and the wider range of what Buddhist teachings have for that as well, because it's a natural bridge, certainly within year 9, when I was teaching it, from teaching about Buddhist ethics into the GCSE. So the resources aren't finalized, they're not perfect, and I want anybody who takes on these resources that we've developed to take them further, to develop them for their own setting. Certainly the local issues, you know, if we look outside our classrooms, there's so much going on that you can latch onto and make pupils aware of and get them to think ethically. And this unit has had a massive impact on my teaching at the moment, because I'm teaching about animal rights and how all of these ideas are starting to link in and flow through. And then the other issues about looking at other ideas like sentientism, and so it's a box that's exploding with ideas. There you go.
Thank you, Matt, and to Kate and Rebecca as well. Yeah, again, a lot of themes are starting to come up, it feels, across the different sort of presentations that probably people want to discuss a lot further. Our final presentation then, before we move to a breakout discussion, is from Dr. Nigel Fancourt, and Nigel is an Associate Professor of Education and Values at the University of Oxford, and is also the chair of the board that sets the RE curriculum in Oxfordshire. So it was new to me as an English teacher quite recently that RE is, of course, an area where there isn't a national curriculum. So that might be an area of opportunity. But Nigel's going to talk a little bit about his research and ethics education and the environment. Thank you, Nigel.
Great, thank you very much, Megan, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to the organisers for putting this together. I'm going to talk about a research project I've got going with various colleagues internationally, which zooms out a little bit from what you've heard so far, different kind of level, about the kind of interrelationship between sustainability education and the way that comes into conflict with, or not, freedom of religion and belief, and the right to education. So really how it comes up against human rights principles. So I'm interested in this kind of puzzle, basically. As to how I got there myself, I've worked here in the Department of Education for about 15 years, doing a lot of work around religious education, and my background is as an RE teacher, like Matt, actually, you know, delivering those kinds of lessons quite often. But my work here in the department is really, a lot of it has focused around RE pedagogy and RE assessment, and a recent project was looking at some of these issues around argumentation. How do children learn to argue, particularly around ethical reasoning generally? And I can see Jessica Chan here, who was one of the other researchers on that project. So some really interesting work we were doing around that. And that was interdisciplinary. That wasn't just in RE, that was in science as well. So I know Richard Jones has put a question, I think, in the chat about the issue of kind of religion science. We were also interested in looking at the way our argumentation in different subjects pans out across the curriculum. So some of those kinds of wider issues. And so that's been part of what I've done. The other thing I've become interested in is some of the issues around human rights in education, particularly the right to freedom of belief, which is seen as very strong in education, and alongside that, the right to education itself, which is often manifested typically in this right for parents to educate their children according to their own religion and or beliefs, whatever they may be, but also importantly, for them to have the right for their children not to be educated according to some other kinds of rights and beliefs. So a kind of negative freedom, typically manifested in the opt-out provisions within RE, both in England and Great Britain and more widely, that you can opt out of the subject under certain kinds of circumstances. That's sort of manifestation of that. And that's in Britain, goes back even before the compulsory nature of education. It goes back to the 1830s, actually. It's a really sort of fundamental right of parents to do that. So how do these things kind of rub up against each other in sustainability education? I mean, one of the sort of burning issues around sustainability education is the kind of advocacy role it has. I mean, sustainability education is because we as society, as educationalists, as curriculum designers, want children to behave in a slightly different way from the generation before. We want the world to be differently constructed. We want them to take on certain kinds of responsibilities, for them to adopt certain kinds of things. So there's this quite strong advocacy dimension, really, which is at stake here, or potentially at stake in sustainability education. So put it another way, you could just simply teach pupils, the facts about sustainability or about the state of the world or whatever. You could also infuse that with the kind of values that you wanted children to take forwards, to develop in various kinds of ways. And Rebecca's frustration, I think, was really telling, that actually they didn't buy into it somehow. It was just another bit of an exercise they just had to do. And so, there's something important about that, and something important about what teachers want to achieve or not achieve. There's various things in education where we do take a kind of, moral reasoning and moral behavior is something we do want to pass on to children, in ways in which, their parents may or may not take part in, so there are kind of limits to that, but that's a kind of a puzzle really to investigate, and to unpick really. And as the issues become more and more important, then the desire for that becomes kind of stronger and stronger. But then it also actually looks kind of almost, more like verging on a kind of propaganda, if you like, or could be interpreted as that, rather than, I'm simply teaching children how to think ethically. So there's a sort of a puzzle there. Now, the current research I've been working on with colleagues is actually doesn't take a particular stand itself, but it's been working with some colleagues, particularly in Sweden, to look at a four-nation comparison of curriculum across those four countries as to how they deal with this issue. So it's led by Sweden. If you think of Sweden, you think of Greta Thunberg, for example. What kind of an education did she have that allowed her to get to the position that she's now in? There's a sort of interesting question there. So a country with very strong concern about the environment, but also strong principles about human rights. So led by them, and this project will be really kind of managed by them. So I'm helping them in that project. 3 researchers there from the University of Gothenburg and one from up in the north, from Umeå, Kaninspora. And then working with a colleague in Norway, so just over the border from them, different kind of construction on things. Also with Norway, heavily invested in the oil industry. I mean, Norway is as rich as it is because of all the North Sea oil. So although it's concerned about the environment, it also has a different kind of political position in terms of that. And also with the Netherlands as well, with a guy called Ole Andreas Kramer in Oslo, and then another colleague in the Netherlands, Kok Bakker at the University of Utrecht. So if we think of the Netherlands, we think of everyone bicycling everywhere, and the whole kind of interconnected transport system. So a really kind of, different, very systematic approach to these kinds of issues and to the way that they think about living in society, living in the world, living in the environment, and the ways that governments can behave around that. So what we're planning to do is look at some of the European documents. All these 4 countries have signed up to all the European documents within the Council of Europe. Even though we're not part of the EU, we're still part of the Council of Europe. So we still interested in those kinds of things. And we're still, for the moment and for a while now, with the Labour government, part of the European Court of Human Rights. So at one level, we're all using the same kinds of documents. But actually, if we then look across the different syllabuses in the different countries, what do we see there? Are there differences in approach in terms of how environmentalism and sustainability are talked about? Do they take a different kind of normative values approach generally across the curriculum? Does that pan out into different kinds of subjects? Are some subjects a bit more descriptive and others are a bit more value laden? So we're interested in that. What we also want to do is interview some teachers. We're going to choose actually top end of primary or potentially key stage 3. So actually very like Matt and Rebecca, partly we want teachers in systems who teach across the whole curriculum. What we don't want to have to do is interview a whole bunch of different subject teachers across all 4 countries, because that would be a complete nightmare to organise the research around. So at that kind of phase of education, how does someone like Rebecca, move across these different areas, deal with the science and the RE and the English or whatever? How do these things come together and flow? How do the values transfer from what we might call, the facts in various kinds of ways? And we're going to interview, the plan is to interview pupils and also parents as well. Clearly part of this is about what extent parents are happy or unhappy with this in various kinds of ways. So at the moment, we don't know if the project's happening. It's a bid to the Swedish government for some Swedish funding. But really, I think today it's just a way of kind of showing the ways in which educational research is thinking about these issues, and I think raising this wider question of, if you like, are there limits to sustainability education? What do we think are the kind of the ethical limits around which we should or shouldn't push things beyond the rights of the individual child and or the individual parents? So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nigel. And yeah, we've heard a lot there from some different perspectives. So to make the most of the time we've got left, we're going to move now into some breakout rooms so that those of you who are here can take the opportunity to chat to some of the other teachers. We'll do that for just less than 10 minutes maybe. So if we could come back about 20 past. So you've got a chance to respond to what you've heard a little bit, have a chat together. We'll come back to the main room at about 20 past, and then if you've got questions for the speakers that have come up in those conversations, we can ask those at the end and have a bit of a discussion with all the speakers about some of the issues that have arisen. So if, Joe, you're happy to put us into breakout rooms now, that'd be great, thank you. Welcome back to the main room. Hopefully we've got everyone back with us now, and we've just got about 5 minutes left, so that if there are kind of questions that people wanted to put to the speakers, maybe things that came up in their discussion, probably one of the things you might have been talking about is how can this kind of how can the ideas, how can the themes that we've been talking about work in my context? But anyone who has an observation or a question to put to the speakers, this is a moment to do that. So you can either raise your hand or pop a question into the chat, and I will hopefully see.
There's a question there, Megan. Tony.
Tony? You want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, no, it's not a question, but since no one else was saying anything, we were just at the very end of our bit, just talking about that bit between mythos and logos. And I mean, they're quite fancy terms in some ways, but it does seem to me it's a really important aspect across the whole curriculum. I mean, certainly within Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, to talk with children about different ways of understanding the world and the ways in which religion particularly has very often used story, narrative, metaphor and myth, but that actually, that really important point that it's both and.
Yeah, thank you. I was really struck by coming up the idea of generally about sort of argumentation and debate. And Matt, you mentioned how positive your scheme had been for encouraging oracy, and oracy is really under the spotlight at the moment as something that needs encouragement throughout the curriculum. And I suppose a kind of link between everything there is how can we help frame for students the appropriate ways of talking about what are very contentious issues, very emotive issues, in ways that encourage them to be thoughtful, nuanced debate, speakers who are aware of many different perspectives. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of come back to that, but yeah, what are the really successful ways of creating debate in the classroom, or creating the frameworks that people can have these difficult conversations?
Well, I was going to suggest that I use philosophy for children often in the classroom, which is a way of looking at a particular issue or area of study and looking at the Socratic method, so breaking down and questioning a source or a stimulus. And climate change and climate issues are so packed full of stimulus that the pupils would have seen on TV, in books, hopefully in books, on TikTok or on the social media, and they'd be able to discuss those ideas, but it's having the framework in which to critically appraise that. And I think hopefully over the next couple of years, as oracy is more developed within our schools, that those formats can be rolled out. I think our religious education in schools is one of the perfect vehicles to drive oracy as well. I think there's a lot of research going on around the country about how RE aids oracy and aids pupils to be able to vocalize their thoughts. And it's because it's about that particular side of what their worldview is and how it impacts with other people's worldviews, that's the way that we get it, without the clash of ideas, really. But that's my thoughts anyway.
Thank you, Matt. I'm just noting as well, perhaps for the final point, Johnny saying in the chat, the challenge, and this is familiar across all the subjects that we've talked about, the challenge of fitting this in alongside GCSE and A-level specs, which in this case focus more on theology. And so maybe any final observations, because certainly from an English point of view, that's a conversation that we're always having is, how can we work with the sort of constraints of the curriculum and also introduce lots of environmental approaches, and there are lots of ways of doing that creatively. But maybe a final comment on how even within GCSE and A-level, where there is a set curriculum, there are ways of kind of integrating these.
Very quick final comment. We need to build a network of people who can contribute what they can, and some will fight quite vocally, some won't, some will just quietly design some fabulous resources that they can share. We need to take it really seriously, and we need to just act. So if you want to be part of a network, put your email in the chat, not the chat, sorry, the evaluation form, and make yourself known, and that email will get back to me. We're deliberately building a network of teachers now. It's really hard. It might not even be possible, but that's, we just have to try our best.
Thank you, Kate. Well, I feel like you've definitely sort of brought us to the end there, and we have run out of time. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone, today. Just the final thing from me before we go. Thank you to all the speakers who've given up their time to share the projects they've been working on and the research they're working on, and introduce us to a lot of meaty ideas. We would ask you, if you can, to fill in the event feedback form for the Deanery. That would be brilliant. And as we mentioned, there is a question on that form which asks you if you're interested in staying in a network and making a sort of community of practice around these subjects. Please do leave your details in the right bit of the form so we can contact you. And then you can hopefully contact each other and share these ideas. I think that the RE Connect resources will be up fairly soon, won't they, on a website?
As soon as possible. And if I have email addresses, I can actually give you a personal heads up rather than you having to check the internet routinely.
Great.
But if you're involved with RE networks like RE Hubs, if you go to RE Online, if you get the Cullen St Gabriel's newsletter, if you get any input from RE Today or NatTre, any of these bodies, ARIAC, already, this will all be sort of shared with you through the usual social media networks.
Thanks, Kate. And then finally, from the Deanery Sustainability team, we'd just like to let you know about our next subject-specific webinar that's coming up. So please do share this with colleagues. We've got a webinar coming up about geography. So we've got a huge range of geography experts talking about strategies for teaching the environment within geography. So please do pass that on to any geographers you know be interested, any geography teachers. And thank you very much for coming along this evening. Hopefully you've taken away some interesting ideas to apply wherever you teach or wherever you work. Thank you very much.